The sterile air of the hospital buzzed with tension as I lay there, barely conscious. My body screamed in pain, but my son's words cut deeper. "Don't waste the good room on her." Still, I didn't flinch. As the doctors rushed around me, my mind was already plotting. That's when I realized, if they wanted to ignore me, I'd make them see me. I bought the entire wing. Let them watch as I turn this place into a monument of my strength. No one underestimates me again. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sterile white light of the emergency room flickered overhead as Lena's limp body was hurriedly wheeled down the hallway, the wheels of the stretcher screeching with each sharp turn. Her head lolled to one side, her face pale against the bright, sterile sheets. Blood stained the lower half of her blouse, darkening the fabric as it spread, and the low, rhythmic beep of her heart monitor was the only sound that filled the tension-heavy air. The emergency room doors slammed open with force as two nurses and a doctor, faces gripped with professional urgency, pushed her into the ICU, where an array of equipment awaited, each device silently offering its lifeline. "She's in critical condition." The paramedic's voice was sharp, focused. "Blood pressure's dropping. We need to stabilize her fast." "Get the OR team on standby," the attending physician ordered, his voice calm, but his eyes betraying the storm of stress inside. From the corner of the room, Jordan Matthews stood, arms crossed, leaning against the wall with the kind of posture that suggested disinterest, even disdain. His eyes, still clouded with sleep from being woken in the middle of the night, darted over the scene, the chaos of medical personnel, the beeping machines, and his mother's lifeless body in the center of it all. The truth was, Jordan couldn't be bothered. His mind was elsewhere, annoyed that his peaceful night had been interrupted by a phone call about his mother's accident. He glanced down at his phone, scrolling absently through text messages, pretending to be preoccupied. Then, as Lena's body was being moved closer to the ICU's operating table, Jordan spoke, the words cold and cutting, almost as if he were bored. "Don't waste the good room on her," he muttered, not loud enough for the doctors or nurses to question him, but the venom in his voice carried like a poison through the sterile air. A doctor's head jerked toward him, but only for a second before he turned back to his work. The nurses, their faces a mixture of disbelief and professionalism, didn't flinch, didn't respond, as they continued to do their job with machine-like precision. But the words, they landed like a strike, a slap to the face. Lena's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, a frail, unconscious shell of the woman she had been moments ago. But as Jordan's cruel words echoed in her mind, something stirred deep within her. Her pulse quickened in response, even though her body felt weak, immobile. "Don't waste the good room on her." They burned through her, deep. She felt the sting of it, sharper than the glass in her chest, more cutting than any fracture in her bones. The pain of her body, bleeding and broken, was nothing compared to the brutal ache in her heart. Jordan. Her own flesh and blood. Lena's vision blurred in the dimly lit ICU, fading in and out like a television signal that couldn't decide whether to work or not. Her eyes flickered open briefly, the whites bloodshot, but the sharpness in her gaze remained unshaken. For a moment, everything around her felt muffled, like a thick veil had descended between her and the world. She tried to move, just an inch, but it was impossible. Her body was an alien thing to her now, disconnected, unresponsive. But her mind? Her mind was alert. Her mind was clear. "So, this is how it's going to be, Jordan?" she thought, the silent words cutting like knives through the haze. "This is how you repay me?" The sharp beeping of the heart monitor accelerated as her thoughts raced faster. The anger was a fire now, burning through her broken body, but it didn't matter. She had no choice but to let it grow, to let it consume her. This wasn't just about pain anymore, it was about control. And if she was going to survive this, if she was going to fight, she needed to focus on one thing: retribution. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the years before, to everything she had given up to build this empire, to raise her children. She had done it all, sacrificed everything for her family. And this was how they repaid her? No, not this time. Her eyes fluttered again, a brief flicker of life. And though her body couldn't move, her mind was already calculating, already strategizing. The gears began turning in her head. What she needed, what she could do, what she would make him see. She's stabilizing. A voice pierced through the fog of her thoughts. A soft whisper, followed by the sound of her pulse settling into a steadier rhythm. The doctors and nurses were still working frantically, but the tension seemed to ease as they completed their work. But Lena's mind never stopped. Let him think he's won. Let him think I'm broken. Let him think that this will be the end of me. It won't be. It's only the beginning. Her fingers twitched. Her hand brushed against the edge of the bed, the cold steel bar beneath it sending a pulse of sensation through her arm. They'll regret this. Every last one of them. They'll regret ever underestimating me. She let her mind race further, her plan unfolding in the dark, quiet corners of her consciousness. A single word echoed in the silence: revenge. And with that, her eyes closed again. But the fire that had ignited in her soul refused to dim. The room faded out. But the war was just beginning. The harsh fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically as Lena slowly regained consciousness. She felt the weight of her body, heavy and disconnected, as though it belonged to someone else. The pain was muted but pervasive, a dull hum at the edge of her awareness. She blinked, her vision blurry, then focused. Her surroundings came into sharper view. The antiseptic smell, the hum of machinery, the rhythmic beeping that filled the otherwise quiet room. She wasn't sure how long it had been since the accident, but the steady presence of the heart monitor told her she had survived, and she would fight to make sure Jordan and the rest of them knew that. A sharp sigh escaped her lips as she tried to lift her hand, the movement sluggish, but the muscles responded reluctantly. Her fingers brushed against the cold steel of the bed frame. The familiar ache in her body seemed secondary to the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind, thoughts that weren't just about survival, but about something far more urgent, something far more painful. Her family, Jordan. The words he had spoken echoed in her mind like a curse, still ringing in her ears. Don't waste the good room on her. Lena's jaw tightened. His indifference had stabbed deeper than any physical wound. How are you feeling? Came a voice from the side, soft and concerned. Lena turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Nina's familiar face. Nina Wilson, her best friend and legal advisor, stood at her bedside, her expression a mixture of worry and concern. She was dressed in her usual professional attire, a dark suit, her hair neatly pulled back. But there was something in her eyes that said she had been here longer than Lena had realized. Nina's gaze softened as she gently reached for Lena's hand. You've had quite the ordeal. Lena's lips quirked up slightly in the ghost of a smile. I'm still here, she rasped, her voice rough. Then, leaning closer, she whispered, her tone heavy with resolve. He'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. Nina hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her face as she met Lena's gaze. Lena, don't. You need to focus on getting better. You've been through too much already. Lena squeezed Nina's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I'm fine. I'll be fine. But She cut herself off, her eyes narrowing as she stared past Nina, lost in thought. Nina sighed, conflicted. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that I've given them everything, Lena said quietly, and they've repaid me with nothing but disdain. I've built this family, this empire, and they treat me like a burden, like I'm already gone. She paused, her breath sharp as her mind began to focus, to plan. They won't get away with it. Not this time. Nina took a deep breath, clearly concerned but unwilling to back down. And what exactly do you have in mind? Lena's eyes glinted with a new fire. I'll buy the damn hospital wing, she said softly, but with finality. I'll make sure they understand exactly who's in charge. The idea formed quickly, as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She had the money, she had the influence, and if she couldn't control her family's loyalty, then she would control their respect. If she had to buy that respect, she would. And buying this hospital wing would send a message louder than any confrontation could. Nina's brows furrowed, a flicker of concern crossing her face again. Lena, you're not well. You're still recovering, and… I'm well enough, Lena interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. The doctors are doing their part. But this is my part. Nina didn't argue further, knowing when to push and when to back down. If that's what you want, then I'll help. I'll get the paperwork ready. Lena's lips tightened. Good. The door creaked open, and Jordan's voice cut through the quiet room. Is she awake? He asked, his tone casual as though he had just walked into a mundane meeting. His footsteps were heavy, the sound unmistakable in the otherwise still room. Lena's body stiffened, but she made no outward movement, pretending she hadn't noticed the shift in her surroundings. Jordan entered the room, his face creased with frustration, his eyes still glazed with the remnants of sleep. How are you feeling? He sounded almost as though he were asking the question out of obligation, his eyes flicking briefly to the heart monitor, then back to Lena. Lena's heart thudded once, loudly in her chest, as she watched him, feeling the weight of his presence. He had no idea. None of them did. But they would. She would make them see. I'm fine, Lena replied coolly, her eyes narrowing before turning to Nina. Do you have the information on the hospital? I'll need it sooner, rather than later. Nina nodded silently, sensing the shift in Lena's mood, her mind already moving toward the legal logistics of the plan. Jordan shot a glance at his wife, Natalie, who had just entered behind him, her smile faltering when she saw Lena awake. She's awake, Jordan said dryly, clearly more interested in something on his phone than in his mother's health. As they stood there, Lena's attention shifted. Her mind suddenly focused on the conversation Jordan and Natalie were having in low voices. She could hear their words as if they were meant for her. I don't care what it takes, Jordan said, his voice sharp. We need to get control of the estate. Her will, her shares, everything. She's going to be incapacitated for a while. This is our moment. Natalie's laugh was low, almost too sweet. Once she's gone, we'll have everything we need. We'll have control of it all. No one will stand in our way. Lena's blood ran cold, her heart hammering in her chest as the words sank in. They were already planning. They were already thinking about how to take everything she had worked for. And they thought she was finished. Her mind clicked into gear. They had no idea what she was capable of. Slowly, her lips curled into a tight smile. They'll regret this, she murmured under her breath, her fingers twitching at the edge of the bed, her plan now set into motion. The game had changed. And this time, the rules were hers. The morning light crept through the blinds, pale and indifferent, casting long shadows across the sterile hospital room. The sound of the heart monitor continued its rhythmic beep, but Lena's mind was no longer occupied with the slow, steady pulse of her survival. It was consumed by something much bigger. Revenge. Her body still ached. Muscles sore, joints stiff. but the pain in her bones was nothing compared to the fire that burned within her. Her plan was already in motion: the hospital wing. Jordan's arrogance, the disrespect. She would make them see that she wasn't weak, wasn't some frail old woman waiting to be written off. Lena's fingers twitched beneath the crisp white sheets, the beginnings of a smile playing on her lips as she imagined the look on her son's face when he realized what she had done. The phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking her concentration. Nina's name flashed on the screen. She tapped it impatiently. "What's the update?" Lena asked, her voice hoarse but sharp. "We've got a meeting with the CEO tomorrow," Nina replied, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of concern. "I've handled the paperwork. The hospital's lawyer is already involved. You'll need to make your case directly to them, Lena. They won't just sell you the wing without a fight." Lena's gaze flicked to the window, where the world outside seemed so far away, as though she were no longer a part of it. The deal was close. Too close to back down now. She wasn't going to let anyone stand in her way. Not Jordan, not the hospital executives. No one. "I'll handle it. You just make sure the papers are ready," Lena said, her voice cold, measured. There was a pause on the line before Nina spoke again, her concern thickening. "I'm warning you, Lena. This could backfire. If you push this too hard, Jordan might use it against you. He could make you look unstable or unreasonable, more of a burden than a benefactor." Lena let out a soft, almost imperceptible laugh. "Let him try. I want him to see how much control I still have." Nina didn't reply immediately, but Lena could hear the worry in her silence. She understood the stakes, but there was no turning back now. The next day, the sterile boardroom felt more like a courtroom than a place for a business deal. Lena sat at the head of the long conference table, her back straight, eyes piercing, her presence commanding despite the soft cough that escaped her as she tried to clear her throat. Her health was improving, but her body still fought against the aftershocks of her accident. The hospital CEO, a tall man with an air of practiced indifference, sat across from her, flanked by his legal team. His name was Harold Grayson, and he had the kind of face that didn't reveal much. But Lena could read people like an open book. And she knew Grayson wasn't as calm as he appeared. He was calculating, trying to gauge her next move. "I understand you want to purchase an entire wing of the hospital, Ms. Matthews," Grayson began, his tone neutral but stiff. "However, I'm sure you can appreciate that such a transaction isn't simple. It requires approval from the board, legal reviews, financial audits." "I'm aware," Lena interrupted smoothly, her voice firm, unwavering. "Which is why I've already arranged for a lawyer to handle the legalities and the necessary paperwork. I'll be covering the full cost up front. No questions asked." Grayson's brow furrowed, but he masked it quickly. "We can't just sell a wing without understanding the full ramifications, Ms. Matthews. You're requesting more than a simple acquisition. You're asking to take full control of an entire department." "I know exactly what I'm asking for," Lena said, her eyes locking onto his. "And I don't care about the politics. I care about getting what I want. You'll sell me this wing, or we can make this process much more difficult for everyone involved." A tense silence hung in the air. Grayson shifted in his chair, clearly trying to mask his surprise at her boldness. There were whispers from his legal team, murmurs of doubt. But Lena wasn't about to back down. Not now. "I'll have the paperwork prepared by tomorrow," she said, her voice crisp, final. Grayson looked at his team and then back at her. After a long pause, he gave a tight nod. "We'll consider your offer. Expect a formal response in the next 48 hours." Lena smiled coldly, leaning back in her chair, the faintest glimmer of victory in her eyes. She had won, for now. That evening, after the meeting, Lena stood by her hospital bed, her eyes narrowing as she gazed out at the city below. The faint outline of the skyline blurred in the distance, a world she had built. And now, one she was willing to tear apart if it meant regaining control. She was still weak, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She had done what she needed to do to set the wheels in motion. The hospital wing was as good as hers. Her phone buzzed again. Nina's name flashed once more. "Lena, they agreed," Nina said, her voice breathless, the excitement in her tone unmistakable. "They're moving forward with the deal. You have the wing. It's yours." A surge of triumph rushed through Lena's veins, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sweetness of the victory settle in. This was only the beginning. She could already hear the whispers in the halls of the hospital, the murmurs of disbelief, of fear, as her presence settled in like an unshakable shadow. But then, just as quickly, the feeling of victory turned to something else, something far colder. Jordan hadn't even seen it coming. As Lena placed the phone back down, her fingers grazed the cold steel of the bed's frame again, her mind already calculating the next steps. She had made her move. Now, it was time for the real strike. The game had changed. But the final round was just beginning. And this time, she was in charge. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, almost imperceptibly, like a constant reminder of the sterile prison Lena had been thrust into. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and faintly of the flowers Jordan had sent, though Lena hadn't been able to stomach the gesture, and the flowers were now wilting by her bedside. Her body still felt like a broken thing, but her mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in years. She hadn't yet fully healed, but she was well enough to begin making her next move. Her pulse quickened at the thought of the hospital wing, now hers, the first piece of the puzzle in her grand strategy. The door to her room creaked open, and Jordan stepped inside, his eyes still heavy with sleep, his posture betraying his lack of concern. He had barely bothered to change out of his disheveled clothes, a wrinkled shirt and jeans. He seemed more irritated than anything else, glancing at his phone as if he couldn't be bothered to give his mother more than a passing glance. "How's the queen of the house feeling today?" Jordan asked, his tone flat, dismissive. He didn't even bother to sit, leaning against the doorframe instead, his arms crossed, as if he were evaluating her as one might a piece of furniture. Lena's eyes fluttered open, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, watching the man who had been her child, the son she had raised and sacrificed for, now standing in front of her with that same old bitterness. "Not great," she replied dryly, keeping her voice steady. "I'm still in pain." Jordan's lips twisted into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so bitter. "Yeah, well, I'm sure it's a lot to deal with. The whole wing, the ICU, the doctors." He paused, his gaze flitting toward the flowers and the various hospital equipment. "Must be nice, though. Not every mother gets to be so special." Lena could feel his sarcasm dripping off his words like venom. It made her insides curl, but she forced herself to hold still. She had more important things to focus on now. His attitude, the way he tried to mask his frustration under a guise of indifference. "You know," Jordan continued, walking over to the window, his back to her. "The cost of this place? It's ridiculous. All of it. You're wasting money, Mom." "For what? Just to prove a point?" A cold smile tugged at the corner of Lena's mouth. "He thinks this is about money." She'd show him how wrong he was. "I'm not doing this for you, Jordan," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I'm doing it for me." Jordan shot her a sharp look, as if her words didn't quite register. "Yeah, well, it's nice to know that you've still got all your priorities in order," he muttered, turning away from the window. He took a few steps toward the door, clearly ready to leave. "Just don't forget, all of it, is going to be someone else's problem soon. When you're not around anymore, who's going to be left to clean up your mess?" Lena's gaze hardened. He had no idea what he was playing with. As Jordan stepped out of the room, Lena let her thoughts linger on his words. The subtle cruelty, the venom, the dismissive attitude. She had known for years that he resented her, but she had never fully understood the depths of his resentment. She lay back against the pillows, letting her mind churn as she heard the low murmur of voices coming from the hallway. Her attention snapped to the door as she overheard Jordan's conversation with Natalie, his wife. "She's out of her mind, you know?" Jordan's voice was muffled, but the bitterness was clear. "Buying up a hospital wing like it's nothing. She's being selfish, thinking she can control everything. This whole damn thing is costing a fortune." "You're telling me?" Natalie replied, her voice dripping with insincerity. "She's always been like this. It's like she never learned to let go. She needs to realize it's not just about her anymore. We need to take control, Jordan. For the business. For the future." Jordan's laugh echoed through the walls. "I know. I'm not letting her ruin everything I've worked for. She thinks she's still in charge, that she can just dictate the terms. I'll make sure she knows she's nothing without me." Lena's chest tightened. The words they were speaking, her son, her family, plotting behind her back. It was worse than she had imagined. They had been planning this for months, maybe longer. Her son, the man she had protected and nurtured, was more of a stranger to her than she had ever realized. She closed her eyes, taking slow, deliberate breaths. She had underestimated him. That was the last mistake she would make. She had to stop thinking of him as her son and start seeing him for what he really was. A rival. A rival who believed he could take everything from her. Her wealth, her power, her legacy. And Lena Matthews didn't lose. The door clicked shut, the conversation fading as Jordan and Natalie moved away. But Lena wasn't listening anymore. She was already planning her next move. She had given them everything. Now it was time to take back what was hers. And Jordan would learn just how wrong he was. Her fingers tightened into a fist, a silent promise. She would show him exactly how much control she still had. As the evening sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting the room into shadow, Lena whispered to the empty space around her, her voice barely above a breath. "You'll regret this." And somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear the echoes of the coming storm. The room was a masterpiece of luxury, the kind of space one only encountered in the rarest, most exclusive corners of the world. The walls were a soft, opulent cream, with gold accents that glimmered in the dim, ambient light. A view of the city stretched before Lena, the skyline bathed in twilight as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every detail, the satin sheets, the hand-picked flowers by the bedside, the carefully placed art on the walls, spoke of control. Her control. The move was almost effortless, a power play she had set in motion days ago. The moment the hospital wing was fully hers, she'd arranged for her treatment to be transferred to this private, serene suite, the kind of room that no one in her family could ignore. Not Jordan, not Natalie. No one. Lena had her body situated comfortably in the plush bed, the drip of the IV barely noticeable against the soft linens, but her mind was racing, sharp as a blade. This room wasn't just for her recovery. It was a statement. A declaration that she wasn't a dying woman to be discarded or manipulated. She was Lena Matthews, and she was far from done. A light knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she said quietly, already knowing who it was. Jordan stepped inside, his face a mix of confusion and irritation. His eyes scanned the room briefly, lingering on the plush surroundings before settling back on his mother. He didn't bother to hide his judgment, his lips twisting slightly. "Must be nice," he muttered, crossing the room to stand near the window, arms folded. "I don't get why you need all this. It's ridiculous, Mom. You really think this?" He waved his hand around the room as though dismissing the luxury. Is going to fix things? Lena's lips quirked into a cold smile. She didn't answer right away, letting the silence hang between them for a beat. Her eyes locked with his, the years of frustration, manipulation, and betrayal swirling beneath her calm exterior. You should have known I wouldn't let you win, she finally said, her voice smooth, every word deliberate. Jordan scoffed and turned away, eyes flitting to the door where Natalie had just entered. She was wearing a tight smile, her eyes scanning the room, likely appraising it for herself. But there was an edge to her expression that suggested she knew she had lost in this battle. I told you she'd go this far, Natalie muttered to Jordan as she sat beside him, her voice a low whisper, though not quiet enough. She always gets what she wants, and now we're stuck in this ridiculous situation. The costs alone. Lena's ears perked at the sound of the conversation. They were already discussing their next move, the way they'd planned to undermine her, to use her for what they could. They couldn't even pretend to respect her anymore. You're not getting away with this. Jordan's voice was louder now, directed at her again. He walked toward the bedside, stopping just short of the hospital chair, almost as if testing the boundaries she had set. You're not the one calling the shots here, Mom. You can't buy your way out of this. Lena's expression remained unchanged, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the plush pillow, as though this moment, this small, silent victory, was simply the beginning. You should go, she said softly, a calm finality in her tone. But first, let me make one thing clear. You and Natalie are welcome to visit, but only under my terms. No more games. No more manipulation. Jordan froze for a split second, his brow furrowing, but he didn't argue. He could feel the shift in power, the growing realization that his mother was no longer the fragile, powerless woman he had assumed her to be. And if I don't comply? He challenged, but there was hesitation in his voice now, uncertainty creeping in. Then you can leave, she replied, her voice so cold it seemed to freeze the air around her. Jordan opened his mouth as if to argue, but before he could speak, a familiar voice interrupted. Everything all right here? Dr. Thomas Gray entered, the longtime family doctor who had been treating Lena for years. He was tall, his features sharp, but there was a warmth in his eyes that seemed genuine. He had always been loyal to Lena, but even he could see the strain between her and her family. Lena looked at him, then nodded slowly. We're fine, Thomas. I just need a few things clarified. Dr. Gray glanced between Lena and Jordan, then back to her. Sensing the tension, but choosing not to address it directly. Of course, Ms. Matthews. If there's anything you need, I'll make sure it's taken care of. Lena felt a flicker of satisfaction, a small piece of the puzzle falling into place. She wasn't sure whether Dr. Gray had fully understood her intentions, but his loyalty was something she could use. And as the conversation drifted to medical matters, she let her mind wander back to her next move. She needed to be careful. Grayson, the hospital CEO, might attempt to disinherit her, or even drag her into a legal battle. But Lena had learned long ago that there was always a counterattack. She had the resources, she had the lawyers, and she wasn't about to let anyone take what was hers without a fight. Her fingers tightened imperceptibly into a fist. Thank you, Dr. Gray, she said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying edge. But there's something you need to know. The doctor's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. Lena leaned forward, her eyes dark with intent. My family's business dealings. I want you to start looking into them. There are things I haven't shared with you. Dr. Gray looked momentarily taken aback, but his professionalism kicked in. Of course, Ms. Matthews. Whatever you need, I'm here. A sharp smile played at the corners of Lena's mouth. The game was just beginning. Lena sat at the head of her bed, propped up by pillows, her fingers gliding over the cool surface of the marble bedside table. The room was quiet now, but the air around her seemed charged with a palpable tension, the kind that lingered long after the words had been spoken. Every breath she took was deliberate, controlled. She could feel the shift in the room, the pulse of power surging within her. Outside, the city lights twinkled like a sea of diamonds, but inside this space, her space, Lena Matthews was becoming something different, stronger, sharper, more dangerous. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Lena called, her voice cool and steady. The door creaked open and Jordan stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he took in the room. The opulence, the power she had claimed, everything about this place seemed to unsettle him. But she saw the hunger behind his eyes, the same hunger he had always had. The same greed that had driven him to act without respect, without understanding. "You've made your point," Jordan said flatly, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're in control now. What's next? You plan on holding me hostage here too?" Lena tilted her head slightly, the corners of her lips pulling into a knowing smile. "I didn't bring you here to argue with you, Jordan," she said, her voice soft but filled with steel. "I brought you here because you need to understand what's coming." Jordan's eyes flashed with irritation, but he said nothing. He was testing the waters, trying to provoke her into a reaction. "Here's the thing," Lena continued, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You can't win this fight, not unless you stop trying to play me. And you're running out of options." Jordan took a step closer, his expression hardening. "You think you've got everything figured out, don't you? You've been playing games with me for years, using guilt, manipulation." His voice faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm done being your puppet." Lena's smile remained, though it was no longer cold, it was something far more deadly. "You think I'm the puppet master? That's cute. But I've never been the one pulling the strings, Jordan. You and Natalie, you've been plotting behind my back for far too long. It's time you learned your lesson." Her words cut through the room, the silence that followed hanging heavy between them. Jordan shifted uncomfortably, but Lena could see the calculation in his eyes. He had been testing her, probing her vulnerabilities. But now he was beginning to realize the extent of his own miscalculation. "I'm not afraid of your threats," Jordan said with a half laugh, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can't control me forever." "Control?" Lena repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "No, Jordan. I don't need to control you. I just need to show you who's really in charge." He stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're sick, Mom. You're letting this place, this whole situation go to your head. You're losing it." "Am I?" Lena asked, her eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating gaze. "Or am I simply setting the stage for the real game to begin?" Jordan blinked, a slight flicker of uncertainty crossing his features before he quickly masked it with bravado. "What are you going to do? Push me out? I've already seen the cracks in your empire. You're vulnerable, Mom. And if you don't watch it, I'll expose everything." The threat hung in the air, but Lena's expression remained unshaken. In fact, the corners of her mouth quirked upward as though she had already anticipated his next move. "You think I'm afraid of you digging into my finances?" she asked, her voice low but cutting. "Let me make something clear. If you expose anything about me, you'll only expose yourself. You have no idea how much I've been keeping hidden from you. You won't find anything you can use. But I'll find everything you're hiding." Jordan paused, his face draining of color. He could feel the walls closing in, the stakes rising with every word she spoke. But he wouldn't back down. "Not yet. I'm not scared of you, Mom," he spat. "I'll make you regret this." Lena's gaze never wavered. "You already do. And you'll regret it even more when you see what I'm capable of." A flash of recognition passed through Jordan's eyes. His defiance was beginning to crumble, but he wouldn't admit it. Not yet. He was still trying to maintain control, trying to convince himself that he had the upper hand, but deep down, he knew he was losing. Lena's fingers curled into a fist, her nails pressing into her palm as she fought the satisfaction threatening to rise within her. But this wasn't over. It wasn't enough to just break him. She had to make him see. "You'll regret underestimating me," she whispered under her breath, more to herself than to him. The silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. She could feel his frustration building, his attempts to control slipping further away. His anger simmered just below the surface, but she knew he was beginning to break. "You think you've won," Jordan said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "But you haven't. Not yet." Lena smiled again, her eyes dark with intention. "No, Jordan, I haven't won yet. But I will." As he turned to leave, Lena let her gaze follow him, the door closing softly behind him. She allowed the tension in her chest to ease slightly, but only for a moment. There was no turning back now. Her health was improving, slowly, but surely. And with each passing day, the plan was becoming clearer. She had already won this round. The real battle? It was just beginning. She smiled to herself, a wicked knowing smile. And the final victory? It was imminent. The weight of the room pressed in on Lena like a vice. She was sitting at the edge of her bed, her fingers trembling slightly as she absently traced the rim of the glass of water on the bedside table. The same glass she'd drunk from 100 times before, but today, it felt heavier, like everything did. Her body ached, the dull throb in her muscles only growing worse as the days went by. And though her health was technically improving, the emotional toll of what she had set in motion was starting to sink deeper into her bones. The strain was beginning to show in her eyes, the sharpness of her resolve dimming just enough for the shadows to creep in. She'd won this round. But at what cost? The tension from her confrontation with Jordan still lingered, the echoes of his anger and the sharp sting of his words reverberating in her mind. But it wasn't just the battle with him that troubled her now. It was the aftermath, the price of the war she had waged against her own family, and the path it had put her on. Her fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of the glass, the chill a sharp contrast to the fire burning inside her. Is it worth it? She wondered, her thoughts spiraling. Is this war for control? For power? Worth the pain it's causing me? The question had been growing inside her, like a seed she hadn't planted but that had taken root, spreading and twisting its way through her thoughts. She had always been in control, always the one who dictated the terms, who fought tooth and nail to build her empire. But now, with each passing day, she felt the toll on her body, the cracks forming beneath the surface of her calculated cold resolve. Another wave of pain rippled through her body, and Lena winced, pressing her palm to her abdomen. The physical toll was one thing, but the mental strain, the constant chess game with her family, the stress of holding everything together while plotting her next move, was becoming unbearable. A soft chime from her phone cut through the tension. She glanced at it absently, then reached for the device, her fingers hovering over the screen. It was a message from Elijah. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything, and I need to ask, are you sure this is the way? Is it worth what's happening to you? To us?" Lena's chest tightened as she read the words. Elijah, her youngest son. The one who had always been the quiet one, the sensitive one, the one who had never asked for the pressure of her legacy, but had felt it all the same. He had been silent through the worst of the storm, but now his message was a quiet plea. Her fingers shook as she typed a response, her mind clouded with guilt. "I'm doing this for all of us, Elijah. You'll understand when it's over." But as soon as the words were sent, she knew it wasn't the truth. Not the whole truth. She had wanted to show them all that she was still in control, to force them to see her power, to make Jordan and Natalie realize the cost of underestimating her. But now, she was starting to wonder, was the price of her revenge too high? What had she sacrificed to get here? Her health? Her peace? And worst of all, her family. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Elijah. "I'm worried, Mom. This isn't you. Please think carefully about the cost. I don't want to lose you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She read them again, the ache in her chest deepening. Her eyes burned, but she didn't let the tears fall. She couldn't afford that kind of weakness, not now. She set the phone down beside her and stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Could she stop this now? Could she back down from the war she'd started? Lena had always prided herself on being strong, on never backing down, but the reality of it was beginning to fracture her. What if I'm losing them? What if this fight is costing me more than just my body? There was a knock at the door, a soft sound that almost seemed to come from another world. She hadn't expected anyone else. Not today. "Come in," she called out, her voice steady, though her insides were anything but. The door opened, and Nina stepped inside, her face drawn tight with concern. She walked over to the bedside, her eyes scanning Lena carefully. "How are you feeling?" Nina asked, her tone gentle but laced with an undercurrent of worry. Lena didn't answer immediately, instead turning her gaze back to the view of the city outside, as though she could find an answer there. "Is it worth it?" "I'm fine," Lena said at last, her voice flat. "The plan's moving forward. We'll take control back." Nina studied her for a moment, then sighed, sitting down beside her. "Lena, I know you've been through a lot, but I've been thinking. You need to ask yourself if this is really what you want. There's a point where it stops being about revenge, about the power. There's a point where you lose something you can't get back." Lena's jaw clenched at Nina's words. "And what's that? Respect? Power? That's what they've always wanted to take from me, Nina. I won't let them win." Nina's eyes softened. "But are you winning, Lena? Or are you losing yourself?" The words hung heavy in the air, and Lena could feel them, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She had been so focused on the fight, on proving something to her son, to her family, that she hadn't stopped to consider the toll it was taking on her soul. For the first time, doubt crept in, small, insidious, but there. What if I've already lost? The silence between them stretched out, and for a moment, Lena thought she might let herself believe it. But then, the anger flared up again, sharp and hot, and she pushed the thought away. "I won't stop," she said quietly, her voice hardening. "I've come too far. I'm not turning back now." But as she spoke, something inside her shifted. Something darker, more uncertain. Was the final victory really within her reach? Or was she just setting herself up for a fall? She didn't know the answer yet. But the battle? It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And as Nina left the room, Lena's fingers tightened into a fist once more. The storm was coming, and it would consume everything in its path. The evening light bled through the window, casting long shadows across Lena's hospital room. She sat still, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline, but her mind was far from the tranquil view outside. The weight of the decisions she had made, decisions that had brought her to this place of tension, of confrontation, of war, pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. Is this really what I want? The question echoed in her mind, but Lena pushed it away. She couldn't afford to doubt now. She was so close to the endgame, to showing them all who was truly in control. But then a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice a little too sharp, betraying the storm raging inside her. The door opened slowly, and there, Standing hesitantly in the doorway was Elijah, her youngest son. Lena's breath caught in her throat for a moment. Elijah was always the quiet one, the one who never fought her for control, who had often watched from the sidelines as his older brother Jordan took center stage. His presence now, standing before her, was a stark contrast to the anger and tension that had filled the room with Jordan. Elijah's eyes were filled with something deeper. Concern, yes, but also something Lena hadn't seen in him for years. A quiet sadness. Lena sat up straighter, her heart tightening as she looked at him. Elijah, what is it? He hesitated, then stepped into the room, his movements slow, deliberate. He closed the door behind him with a soft click, and for a moment there was silence between them. Lena could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of whatever he had come to say, pressing on him as much as it was on her. I need to talk to you, Elijah finally said, his voice lower than usual, almost a whisper. Lena nodded, her brow furrowing. Of course, what's going on? Elijah sat down beside her, not meeting her gaze. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and for a moment it felt like they were two strangers rather than mother and son. Then he finally spoke again, his voice tight. I found something about you, about our family. Something you didn't want anyone to know. And I think you need to hear it. I need you to understand why I'm telling you this. Lena's heart skipped a beat. What could he have found? Her mind raced, flashing through the things she had buried, both physical and emotional, in order to protect her family, to protect her empire. But nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Elijah finally met her eyes, and the words came out in a rush. I found out that the reason Dad left, the reason everything fell apart with him, it wasn't just because of business. You pushed him away. You kept things from us. From him. You buried the truth about how you built your empire, Mom. Lena felt the floor shift beneath her, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? She asked, her voice hoarse, though she tried to keep it steady. Elijah swallowed hard, his eyes pained. You were always so focused on winning, but what you don't realize is that you lost a long time ago. You kept secrets from Dad, from me, from everyone. And those secrets... He stopped, his eyes tearing away from hers. Those secrets are why things ended the way they did. And why Jordan's been like this with you. Lena stared at him, her mind whirling. How could he know? How much had he uncovered? She had built her life on the foundation of control, on bending the world around her to her will, and now her son was telling her it had all been built on something far darker. I didn't want you to carry this, she said softly, her voice shaking for the first time in a long while. I didn't want either of you to know how I got here. Elijah's eyes were filled with emotion now, but there was something else there too. An unspoken plea. I don't want to lose you, Mom, but you've already lost so much. Is it worth it? Is it worth everything you've sacrificed? Your health? Your family? Lena felt something inside her crack. How much had she really sacrificed? The empire she had spent her life building had come at the cost of her family, her marriage, her relationship with Elijah, with Jordan. And now she was standing on the edge of it all, with nothing but the hollow weight of revenge to carry her forward. Was it worth it? She had wanted to take control, to make her son, to make her family understand that she was the one in charge. But now, with the truth laid out before her, she had to face the possibility that her obsession with power had cost her everything she truly cared about. Lena took a slow, deliberate breath. I thought I was doing this for you, for us. But now, I'm not sure anymore. Elijah's voice trembled, but his words were firm. I know you did, Mom, but you have to stop. Please, before it's too late. Lena felt the weight of his words crash into her, the guilt settling deep into her chest. Her grip tightened around the glass of water on her bedside table. The cool surface felt comforting, grounding her in a moment that was slipping away from her faster than she could grasp it. The storm she had created was starting to turn against her. And for the first time, Lena wasn't sure she could weather it. She looked at Elijah, his face torn between hope and fear, and something deep inside her shifted. "I've been so focused on winning," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "that I forgot what I was really fighting for." Lena stared out the window again, the city lights flickering below like distant stars. Was she repeating the same mistakes her father had made? Was she on the edge of losing everything, just like him? Her fingers curled around the edge of the glass, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure what her next move should be. The battle inside her was raging, the past and the present colliding with a force she could no longer ignore. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't know whether to keep fighting or to finally let go. The decision she faced was now more than just about revenge. It was about her soul. And as Elijah left the room, Lena felt the weight of the storm closing in. The question was no longer about control. It was about whether she could survive the cost of the battle she had already begun. The air in Lena's room was still, too still, as she sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers pressed against the cool glass of water. The light from the window cast long, jagged shadows across the floor, but they didn't touch her. The weight of everything, the secrets, the lies, the plans, felt suffocating, and yet it had become familiar. She had lived in the suffocating grip of power for so long, it was hard to imagine life any other way. But now, after the conversation with Elijah, the walls were closing in. She had started this war, had started it to protect herself, to show Jordan and Natalie that she still had control, but the toll it had taken on her soul was starting to feel unbearable. The truth Elijah had revealed, the things she'd hidden from her family, gnawed at her. What if this battle wasn't just about revenge? What if it had been about something darker, something she had buried long ago? Her mind raced as the door to her room opened, and her son, Jordan, walked in, followed by Natalie. Both of them were dressed in a manner that screamed calculated indifference, but Lena could read the nervous energy radiating off them. They knew this moment was coming. It was time to end the game. Lena straightened in her bed, her spine a rod of iron. She was going to win. This was the final round, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jordan spoke first, his voice clipped, his face betraying his frustration. "What's all this about, Mom? You had us brought here for what exactly?" Lena's lips curled into a small, predatory smile. "You'll see," she said, her voice cold as steel and far more measured than it had ever been before. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She wasn't just the matriarch of a family or the wealthy businesswoman trying to control the legacy she had built. No, Lena Matthews had become a force unto herself, a force that wasn't to be reckoned with, no matter how many mistakes she'd made along the way. Jordan glared at her, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes narrowing in defiance. "You think you can keep this up? You think you can keep playing these games with me? With us?" Lena's expression never faltered. "This isn't a game, Jordan. This is business. And you need to understand that I'm still the one in charge." The words hung in the air, and Lena watched the flicker of realization that passed through his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to believe it, but he knew, deep down, that she was right. Everything he had built, everything he had tried to control, was crumbling before him. Natalie spoke up, her voice smooth, but a little too sweet. "You're losing control, Lena. You're not the same woman you used to be, and frankly, we've been more than patient with your antics." Lena's gaze snapped to Natalie, a fire igniting behind her eyes. You think I don't see what you're doing, Natalie? You think I haven't noticed your manipulations? Your quiet little power plays? Don't think for a second that I'm unaware of your game. Natalie stiffened, but she recovered quickly, her face a mask of cool indifference. You've already lost. You're weak, Lena. This whole thing, it's just a last-ditch effort to hold on to something you're clearly losing. Lena leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bed. I'm not weak, and I haven't lost. Her voice dropped lower, quieter, but the command in it was unmistakable. You both will learn that the hard way. There was a brief, tense silence before Lena reached for her phone. She didn't look at Jordan or Natalie as she scrolled through the screen, her face cold and unreadable. When she finally spoke, her tone was so steady that it sent a chill through the room. While you were busy underestimating me, I've made some moves of my own. You're not the ones pulling the strings here anymore. She tapped the screen, then held it out for them to see. On the display, the numbers were clear. She had secured a controlling stake in the family business, enough to wipe out Jordan's claim to power completely. Jordan stared at the screen, his face draining of color as the realization hit him. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and the silence was deafening. You, he stammered, but the words failed him. Lena allowed herself a slow, deliberate smile, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Yes, Jordan, I've taken the reins. Your future here is no longer in your hands. Natalie's eyes flickered with panic, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. You can't do this, she said, though the shakiness in her voice betrayed her. We'll fight this. You can't just... Lena raised a hand, silencing her with a single gesture. Don't waste your breath. You can try to fight it, but I've already set the wheels in motion. This is happening, and you will abide by my terms, not the other way around. Jordan opened his mouth, clearly about to speak, but Lena's sharp gaze cut him off. I've played your game, Jordan. I've let you think you could control things, that you could force me into a corner. But no more. The game is over, and I've won. A dark satisfaction washed over her, and she let out a soft, almost imperceptible laugh. Natalie's desperation was becoming evident now. She tried to shift the conversation, attempted to manipulate the situation, but Lena saw right through it, just as she always had. She wasn't some puppet to be played. Not anymore. You don't get it, Natalie pleaded, her voice rising. You can't just take everything from us. We have rights. We'll go to court. Lena's eyes glinted coldly as she cut her off. Try it. You'll only expose your own weaknesses, your lies, your secrets. She leaned back in her bed, her posture relaxed now, though the storm inside her was far from over. You've been warned. I'm done playing games. And you're both about to find out what happens when you underestimate Lena Matthews. The words were a promise, the final nail in a coffin they hadn't even realized was being sealed. As the door closed behind them, Lena's gaze shifted to the window once more. The city stretched out before her, but it felt like a distant world, one that was already slipping out of her reach. The final battle had begun, and this time, she was going to finish it. On her terms. The soft beeping of the heart monitor filled the otherwise silent room, a reminder of the toll Lena had already paid. She sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers curling tightly around the glass of water, her knuckles white against the cold surface. The room felt oppressive now, the once comforting sterile environment seeming like a cage rather than a place of recovery. The quiet outside the window was a stark contrast to the storm inside her. She had won. At least, that's what she told herself. The controlling stake in the family business was now hers. Jordan and Natalie were cornered, and yet, as Lena looked out over the cityscape, the weight of victory felt heavier than she expected. Her body ached, her muscles sore, her head throbbing with a persistent tension that never fully left. The stress of the confrontation with Jordan and Natalie, the relentless emotional strain, was starting to catch up with her. She hadn't allowed herself to fully recognize it until now. The door opened with a soft creak, and Dr. Gray walked in, his professional demeanor belying the concern in his eyes. He had been her doctor, her ally, for years, but there was no mistaking the look of hesitation on his face now. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of worry beneath it. Lena forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Thomas. Just a little tired." Dr. Gray didn't buy it. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking over the monitors, taking in her vitals, his expression becoming more grave with each second. "Lena, we've been through this before. The stress, this kind of emotional toll, could push you past your limits. You've been under a great deal of pressure lately. You need to rest." Lena sat up straighter, a flash of irritation flickering across her face. "I can't afford to rest, Thomas. Not yet." He sighed, his face softening with concern. "I understand your drive, but you're pushing your body too hard. You need to slow down. Your health, it's deteriorating faster than you realize." Lena's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll deal with that after this is over. I can't stop now. Not when I'm so close." He hesitated before speaking again, his voice quieter. "And what about your family? Lena, I can see the toll this war with Jordan and Natalie is taking on you. You're isolating yourself. Don't let the battle for control cost you everything you care about." The words hit Lena harder than she expected. She had been so focused on winning, on proving herself to her family, that she hadn't fully realized what she was losing in the process. "Everything I care about?" she echoed, her voice tight. She looked down at her hands, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the calm exterior she had worked so hard to maintain. "I've given everything for them. For this family. Everything." Dr. Gray looked at her, his expression full of sympathy. "Lena, I know you've made sacrifices, but don't you think it's time to consider what's truly important? What's the point of winning if you're losing the ones you love in the process?" Lena's chest tightened at the question, and for the first time in a long while, the words of Elijah, their quiet plea, echoed in her mind. "Is it worth it?" She looked at Dr. Gray, her gaze hardening once again, pushing aside the uncertainty that had begun to creep in. "I'm not losing anyone, not yet." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the truth. They were already slipping away. Hours later, as the room grew dim with the fading light, a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Elijah. She hadn't expected him tonight. The distance between them had grown since their last conversation, but she could still see the concern in his eyes as he entered. He hesitated by the door before stepping in fully, his face clouded with emotion. "Mom," Elijah said quietly, his voice almost pleading, "we need to talk." Lena's stomach clenched. She hadn't wanted to face this moment, didn't want to confront the truth of the damage her actions had caused. But now she didn't have a choice. "Sit down," she said, her voice softer now, but no less determined. Elijah sat across from her, his face drawn, his eyes heavy with something Lena couldn't quite place. He looked older than she remembered, as though the weight of everything they had been through had already aged him beyond his years. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Mom," Elijah started, his voice cracking. "I don't know how much more you can take. You're pushing yourself to the edge, and for what? To win a battle? To prove something to Jordan?" Lena's heart twisted at his words, but she didn't show it. She couldn't. "I'm doing this for all of us," she said, her voice low and controlled. "You'll understand when it's over." But Elijah wasn't buying it. "When it's over? What happens then, Mom? What happens after everything falls apart? You're breaking down. You're losing yourself, and I don't want to lose you, too." Lena felt the sting of his words, but she fought to hold it together. What if he's right? The thought was almost too much to bear, so she pushed it down. I'm doing what I have to do, she said, her voice firm again, though it was starting to waver. I'm protecting us. Elijah's eyes were full of hurt now. But you're not just hurting yourself, Mom. You're hurting us. And I can't keep watching this. I can't be in the middle of this fight anymore. It's tearing me apart. Lena's chest tightened. You're not in the middle of anything, Elijah. You don't have to choose sides. But he shook his head, standing up and walking towards the door. I'm not choosing sides. I'm just asking you to stop before it's too late. As the door clicked shut behind him, Lena was left alone with her thoughts, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. The storm she had created was starting to break, and she was caught in the middle of it, torn between winning the war and saving the family she had spent her whole life building. The questions burned in her mind. Is it worth it? Will I lose everything, including myself? The price of truth was heavier than she could have imagined, and now, she wasn't sure she could survive it. The morning light was muted through the blinds, casting faint shadows across the hospital room as Lena sat at the small table in the corner. Her hands were folded in front of her, still trembling slightly despite the calm exterior she forced herself to maintain. The last few days had drained her, physically, emotionally, mentally, and yet, there was no rest. Not yet. Not until it was over. She stared at the phone in front of her, the screen dim, a reminder of the fight that was consuming her every waking moment. It was only a matter of time before the full weight of her actions came crashing down, but she wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. She couldn't afford to let the weakness she felt in her bones seep into her resolve. Not now. Not when she was so close. The door opened and Nina stepped inside, her presence calm but full of concern. There was a heaviness to her steps, a noticeable weariness in her eyes, but she was still the trusted ally Lena needed. Nina paused in the doorway, taking a deep breath before walking over to the bed where Lena sat, her posture rigid, her eyes too sharp to be fully present. Lena, Nina started softly, her tone tempered with care, but there was an edge of urgency beneath it. We need to talk. Lena didn't meet her eyes immediately. She didn't want to hear it. Not today. Nina sat across from her, placing a file on the table between them. I've been reviewing the legal ramifications of your decisions. There's no easy way to say this, but what you're doing is risking everything: the family legacy, the business, your health. She paused, watching Lena's unflinching gaze. And Elijah. Lena stiffened at the mention of her son. She'd been dreading this conversation, the one where Nina would finally speak the truth that she had been ignoring. I'm not backing down, Nina, Lena said, her voice low but fierce, still that same steel running beneath the words. I've worked too hard for too long. I'm not going to let them take everything I've built. Not now. Nina's expression softened, but the underlying concern never faded. I know how hard you've worked, but your methods... Lena, you're isolating yourself from the very people who once had your back. Elijah is feeling the toll. He's caught between you and Jordan, and it's tearing him apart. He doesn't know which way to turn anymore. Lena's chest tightened at the mention of Elijah. His last words to her echoed in her mind. Stop before it's too late. But she couldn't stop. Not when she was so close to winning. I'm not going to lose everything. Not after everything I've sacrificed, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper now, though the bitterness in it was unmistakable. I can't afford to. Nina sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. But Lena, what's the cost? What's the point of having it all if you're left with no one who truly cares about you? No family, no legacy, just power. She sighed, rubbing her eyes. I don't know if I can keep helping you if this is the path you're on. Lena looked down at her hands, the skin of her palms pale as she gripped the table. She didn't want to hear this, not from Nina. She didn't want to admit that her best friend might be right. But the truth was a constant hum in her mind now. She had pushed too hard. Hadn't she? Before Lena could respond, the door opened again, and the tension in the room immediately escalated. Jordan and Natalie entered, their faces twisted with frustration, but masking an edge of quiet desperation. They were no longer in control, and they knew it. Lena's eyes flicked over to them, a cold smile playing at her lips. She had known this moment was coming. They had nothing left but the legal system. And she was prepared. Jordan wasted no time, his voice biting with barely contained anger. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, his words sharp, as if trying to cut through her defenses. "You've manipulated everything, taken control of the business, but you've lost the one thing that mattered: your family. And I'm going to make sure that you pay for it." Lena raised an eyebrow, her fingers stilling on the table as she turned her gaze slowly toward him. "You think you can fight me, Jordan? You think you can take everything back from me? After everything I've done?" Natalie stepped forward, her smile forced, but tight. "You've crossed a line, Lena. If you think this is over, you're wrong. We'll fight you in court. We'll expose you. All of it. Your empire. Your legacy. Gone." Lena's heart was steady now, her pulse slowing with the realization of how little their threats affected her. The game was already in her hands. It always had been. She wasn't going to let them turn the tables now. "I've already set things in motion," Lena replied, her voice calm and cutting. "I've taken full control of the company. You can try to fight it, but you'll lose. And you'll expose yourselves in the process. All your dirty secrets, Jordan. Natalie, don't think you're immune either." The silence that followed was deafening. Jordan's face had drained of color, his eyes darting from Lena to Natalie and back again. They had underestimated her. They still did. "You've got nothing," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "The game is over." The tension between them was thick, the final standoff hanging in the air like a sword about to fall. But Lena wasn't done. "Do what you will," she continued, leaning back in her chair, a cruel smile curling at the corners of her lips. "But remember, I've already won, and I'm going to finish this on my terms." The finality in her words hung like a promise. She had played the game, and she was done being played. It was over. As the door closed behind them, Lena allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. She had won, but at what cost? Elijah's face flashed in her mind, the worry in his eyes. The loneliness she had pushed away. And for the first time, the weight of it all, the power, the victory, the cost, settled fully on her shoulders. She had won the battle. But the real price of her victory was just beginning to unfold. The penthouse was quiet, too quiet. The vast windows stretched high, framing the city below, a sprawling sea of lights and life that felt as distant as a memory. Lena stood by the window, her hands pressed flat against the cool glass, staring out at the skyline, but she wasn't seeing the city. She was replaying everything in her mind, the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, the price of every victory. The confrontation with Jordan and Natalie had left her hollow. The sting of their words, the raw bitterness in the air, it had all settled deep inside her. The power she had fought so hard to claim, to maintain, felt heavy now, like a weight on her chest, suffocating her. She had won. But the cost. Her health, her family, the very thing that had driven her all these years, was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at it, already knowing who it was. Elijah. He hadn't contacted her in days, and the tension between them had only grown. His last message still echoed in her mind. Please, Mom, let it go, before it's too late. Lena picked up the phone, her fingers trembling as she read the message. I'm not giving up on you, Mom. I want to help you rebuild this family. But I can't do it if you keep holding on to the past. Let go of what you're fighting for. Let's fix this. Together. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of hope. She hadn't heard him speak like this in so long, hadn't felt this kind of connection in what seemed like an eternity. Could she still rebuild? Could she undo the damage she had done? She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, but the air felt too thick, too suffocating. The truth weighed heavily on her. For years she had fought to control everything, to carve out a legacy that no one could take from her. But in doing so, she had pushed the very people she loved away. She had alienated her sons, betrayed her own family in the name of power. She had sacrificed peace, connection, and trust for control. And for what? The empire she had built was nothing more than an illusion now, a crumbling monument to a battle she had won, but at what cost? Let it go. The thought echoed again, and this time, she didn't push it away. She had spent so much of her life clinging to control, and now, all she felt was a quiet, gnawing emptiness. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, contemplating everything that had brought her to this point. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, uncertain, as if she were speaking to herself as much as to the empty room around her. I can't keep doing this. The words felt alien coming from her lips, but they were the truth. I've fought for so long, but I'm losing everything I'm trying to protect. Lena turned from the window, her gaze falling on the table where her phone sat. For the first time, she didn't see the threat of losing everything. She saw the possibility of something else, something worth fighting for, rebuilding. She sat down slowly, her hands resting on the table, and typed a reply to Elijah. I'm ready to stop fighting, Elijah. I don't know how, but I want to try. The words felt like a release, as if she were letting go of the burden she'd been carrying for so long. The tension in her chest eased, just a little. But it wasn't over yet. There was more to be done. The following days were a blur. Lena didn't sleep much, and when she did, her dreams were haunted by the faces of those she had hurt, by the empire she had built with so much blood and sweat. But now, her mind was clearer than it had been in years. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about rebuilding, repairing what had been broken. And it started with taking responsibility. She contacted her lawyer, Nina, and arranged a meeting. The next step was clear. Dismantle what she had built, starting with the hospital wing she had bought, the symbol of her power, her final act of control. It was a dramatic move, but it was the right one. Lena was ready to let go. The morning of the meeting arrived quickly. Lena was dressed in simple clothes, no longer wrapped in the veneer of power. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, as though the weight had finally broken her down. But there was something else there now. Resolve. She had made her decision, and she was going to see it through. Nina arrived, her expression guarded but understanding. They sat together in the quiet meeting room, the weight of the past few months hanging in the air. I'm ready to do it, Lena said, her voice steady. Return the wing. Close that chapter for good. Nina nodded, though a flicker of hesitation passed over her face. Are you sure about this, Lena? It's a big step. Lena met her gaze, her eyes resolute. It's the only way forward. Hours later, the paperwork was signed and the deal was done. The hospital wing, once a symbol of Lena's triumph, was being returned. She felt a strange mix of relief and sadness as she signed the final document. It was the end of one era, but the beginning of another. As she walked out of the building with Nina, the cool air felt different against her skin. The weight on her shoulders wasn't completely gone, but it was lighter. She had made a choice, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the right one. But as she stepped into the car, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Jordan. "You think you've won, don't you? But it's not over. Not by a long shot." Lena's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, Lena felt a flicker of peace amidst the storm. She was ready for whatever came next. The office was unnervingly quiet as Lena sat at the head of the long, polished conference table. Her fingers rested lightly on the wood, her posture poised but taut, as if every nerve in her body was stretched to its breaking point. The glass walls of the room framed the city skyline, but today, even the view felt distant, faint, like a memory she was trying to grasp, but couldn't quite hold on to. She had called this meeting one final attempt to end the battle with Jordan and Natalie. No more games, no more subterfuge. This time, it would be on her terms. The door opened with the softest of creaks, and Jordan and Natalie stepped inside, their faces set in hard lines. The tension between them was palpable. Neither of them said a word as they took their seats across from Lena, the silence settling thickly in the air. Lena's gaze flicked briefly to each of them. Jordan, with his arrogance, his never-ending thirst for control. Natalie, all sharp edges and calculated moves, the woman who had used every opportunity to get ahead. But now, they were at her mercy. "You called this meeting," Jordan began, his voice low and filled with the same defiance that had driven their conflict from the start. "What's your play this time, Mom?" Lena's expression softened just enough to make her intentions clear. She had no more anger left to give. The war had worn her down. And now, it was time for something else. Resolution. "I'm done fighting," she said, her voice firm but calm. "And I'm offering you a way out. A way to end this. For good." A flicker of confusion passed between Jordan and Natalie, but it didn't last long. They both leaned forward, drawn into the promise of what came next. Lena's eyes locked onto Jordan's. "You both want control. You want power. I can give it to you. The family business, the legacy, it can all be yours." Natalie's lips curled into a half smile, a look of disbelief in her eyes. "You're serious? After everything that's happened, you want us to take control?" Lena's gaze hardened, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, but every word carrying weight. "On my terms. If you agree to work together, to put aside your differences, the business will be yours. But you'll follow my lead. There will be no more fighting, no more games. This ends today." Jordan's face twisted in anger, his fists tightening on the table. "And what's in it for you, huh? You're giving us the business, but we're still under your thumb. Is that it? You'll never let go, will you?" Lena's lips pressed into a thin line. The past few weeks had shown her the cost of her obsession with control. She didn't want to hold their futures in her hands anymore. She didn't want to force them to play by her rules. But peace had to be made, and this was the only way forward. "I'm letting go," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, but it was enough to silence them. "But I'm still here. I'm still a part of this. And if you can't work together, if you can't respect each other, you will lose it all. I'm giving you a choice. Work for the family or face complete disinheritance. It's that simple." Jordan stared at her, disbelief flashing in his eyes, then quickly morphing into something darker. He was about to lash out, but then he stopped, his hands falling to his sides. Natalie, too, had fallen silent, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the implications of what Lena had just said. "Do you understand what you're offering?" Lena pressed, her voice colder now. "I'm giving you the family business, everything you fought for. But it will be a partnership, If you choose to fight me, or if you choose to tear this family apart again, I will walk away. I will leave you with nothing. That's the cost. And you'll never get another chance. The silence in the room felt endless. Jordan was the first to break it, his voice low, frustrated. You can't just give it to us and expect us to play by your rules. We've been trying to make our own way for years. And now you're telling us to work together? After everything you've done? Lena's eyes narrowed. I've made mistakes. I've hurt you both. But I've spent my whole life trying to protect you, even if you don't see it. This isn't just about control anymore. This is about us, about our family. And if we're going to make it through this, we have to stop tearing each other apart. There was a long pause, each of them processing what had been said, their minds working through the layers of power, pride, and pain that had shaped them all. But in the end, there was only one choice. Jordan exhaled sharply, his expression hardening, then relaxing just a fraction. Fine, he said, though his voice was tight, laced with reluctant acceptance. But don't think this means I'm going to roll over. I'm still going to have my say. Lena nodded slowly, her lips curling into a faint smile. As long as you understand the terms, this is about family, Jordan. Not ego, not power. Natalie remained quiet for a moment longer than Lena expected, but finally, she spoke. You've played us all this time, but I'll play your game, for now. For the business. For the future. Lena let out a breath, releasing the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was done. The war was over. Good, Lena said softly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. We'll rebuild this. Together. She stood up, walking to the window as the weight of the decision began to settle in. The storm inside her had finally calmed. The battle had been fierce, and the cost had been high, but now there was peace. The final decision had been made. And Lena Matthews, once the queen of control, had learned that the true power lay not in holding on, but in letting go. But as she stared out at the city, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Elijah. I knew you could do it, Mom. We're in this together now. I'm proud of you. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt the weight of her empire lift, replaced by the warmth of something she had almost forgotten. Love. The morning light was gentle, spilling into the penthouse with the kind of warmth Lena hadn't felt in years. She sat at the breakfast table, a cup of coffee in front of her, the steam rising in delicate spirals. The city below, once an intimidating, chaotic landscape, now felt smaller, more manageable. The storm had passed. But it was still too soon to say what would come next. Lena's hand trembled slightly as she brought the coffee to her lips, the heat seeping into her fingers. The weight of the last few months pressed on her. She could feel the scars, both visible and hidden, the sacrifices, the choices, the war that had almost torn her family apart. But for the first time, there was space to breathe. Her phone buzzed, a soft reminder that the world outside her small cocoon of peace was still turning, still moving on. She glanced at the screen, her heart tightening as she saw Elijah's name. We need to talk about how to fix this. The words were simple, but they cut deeper than she expected. She had made the decision to rebuild, not just the empire, but her relationship with her sons. But the real work was still ahead. Lena and Elijah sat together in her office later that day, the space between them a little less tense than it had been before. She looked at him as he set down his phone, his face softer now, the youthful anger replaced with a cautious hope. They were no longer adversaries. They were co-conspirators in a rebuilding process that felt both impossible and necessary. I know I've hurt you, Lena began, her voice hoarse with emotion. I never meant for it to go this far. I've always wanted to protect you, but I did it all wrong. I should have seen the damage I was causing. Elijah's eyes softened, but there was still hesitation. He wasn't quick to forgive. Not yet. But that was okay. This wasn't about fixing things overnight. It was about the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust. "You've never given up on us," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "But you've been so focused on control that we didn't know how to reach you." Lena took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling in. "I know. I know it's been like that. I've been so focused on holding everything together that I didn't realize I was losing everything that mattered. I pushed you both away. I'm sorry." There was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just the space needed to let the words sink in. Finally, Elijah nodded, his expression still uncertain, but softer. "We'll figure it out, Mom. Together." Lena smiled faintly, feeling the knot in her chest loosen. Together. The word felt foreign, yet exactly right. The next few weeks were slow, painstaking, and full of small victories. Jordan and Natalie, while still carrying their pride, began to accept the terms Lena had set. It wasn't easy, but they couldn't ignore the consequences of their actions anymore. They were forced to face what they had tried to tear down, and in the process, they slowly began to realize that they needed Lena's guidance, whether they admitted it or not. Lena had spent years fighting for control, never once considering what she might lose in the process. Now, as she worked with her children to restore the family business and reputation, she saw how much she had underestimated the power of simply being there, of offering support instead of demands. It was a Thursday afternoon when Lena walked into the office building with Elijah by her side. The air felt different now, lighter. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't feel suffocating anymore. She had taken steps to restore the company's name, working with legal teams, advisors, and even public relations to begin patching the damage. Her legacy wasn't destroyed, but it would take time to make sure it would stand again on its own, without the bitterness of years of battles lingering behind it. Elijah's presence felt like a quiet victory, one that didn't come with fanfare or celebrations, but rather, the steady reassurance that they were moving in the right direction. They walked together into the conference room, where Jordan and Natalie were already waiting. Jordan had a sharpness in his gaze, but there was no more venom behind it. Natalie still wore her trademark confidence, but it was tempered now. There was an understanding between them all, a kind of quiet acknowledgement of what they had lost and what they still stood to gain. Lena stood at the head of the table, feeling the weight of her decision settle around her. She wasn't the same woman who had come to this office weeks ago, demanding respect. No, she had learned something far more valuable: the power of stepping back. "We're moving forward," Lena said, her voice steady but softer than it had been in the past. "We'll continue to rebuild what's been broken, but it's going to take all of us. Not just me. Not just you." She turned to each of them. "All of us." The room was silent for a moment, each of them processing the shift. But then Jordan spoke, his voice quieter than before. "We'll make it work. For the family." Lena felt something shift within her at those words. It wasn't forgiveness. At least, not yet. But it was the beginning of something new. Later that evening, as Lena sat alone in her penthouse, she watched the city below, a stillness in her chest. There was no fanfare, no celebration, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the pull of control. She didn't feel the need to grasp at every little piece of the world around her. The war had ended, and the rebuilding had begun, not just of the business, but of the bonds she had almost lost. Her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Elijah. "I'm proud of you, Mom. We're all in this together." Lena smiled to herself, the weight of the past finally lifting as she sat back in the chair, allowing herself a moment of peace. The family was healing. The empire was still standing. And for the first time in a long while, Lena Matthews felt that maybe, just maybe, she could let go. The city stretched out before Lena like an intricate map, each glowing light a symbol of a different life, a different path. Each one intertwined with her own in ways she couldn't have predicted. The view from the penthouse window, once a familiar source of comfort and power, now felt almost foreign to her. Her eyes traced the familiar skyline, but the air around her was different. The weight of the past had begun to lift, but the scars of her battles remained, etched deeply in her heart and mind. She sat by the window, her fingers lightly brushing the cool glass, lost in thought. Her reflection wavered slightly in the surface, still strong, still resolute, but with something softer now, a vulnerability that had been hard to see through the years of armor she had built around herself. The war had been long, too long. The empire she had fought so fiercely to protect was still standing, but it had cost her more than she had ever imagined. The walls that she'd built to protect herself, to safeguard her legacy, had kept out more than just her enemies. They had kept out her family, the people she loved most. Lena's gaze softened as she thought of Elijah, the young man who had once been content to stand in her shadow, now walking beside her as an equal. Their relationship, fragile but mending, was a testament to the power of rebuilding. Not just an empire, but trust. They had started to move forward, not just for the business, but for the family. She had learned that control, once her most prized weapon, had become a prison she had locked herself in. A light knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned her head slowly, not needing to look twice to know who it was. She hadn't heard from Jordan in a while. And though she had thought she was done trying to fix their fractured bond, the lingering tension between them was impossible to ignore. Jordan stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He had changed, or at least, he was trying to. The same sharpness in his gaze remained, but there was something else. A weariness, a reluctant acceptance that their old ways of fighting had no place in their new reality. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, voice guarded but less bitter than it had been in the past. Lena motioned for him to sit, her own posture relaxed but firm. "I did. There's something we need to discuss." Jordan's eyes narrowed, clearly on edge, but he settled into the chair across from her. Lena allowed the silence to linger, the weight of the years between them pressing down on both of them. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were," she began, her voice steady. "But I'm asking you to see things differently. The business, the legacy. It's not just about control. It's about what we do with what we have left." She paused, her gaze searching his face. "It's about rebuilding." Jordan shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I've been thinking about it," he said, his voice less sure than before. "And I'm willing to try. For the family." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment it almost felt like the war was over, that the victory they had both fought for was no longer about who was in control, but about what they had left to rebuild. Lena's heart softened, but she didn't let herself relax completely. She knew this was just the beginning. The process of rebuilding would be long and slow, but it was a start. And that was all she could ask for. "I've made mistakes, Jordan," she said quietly, her voice breaking through the silence. "I've made a lot of mistakes, but I can't fix them all at once. I'm asking you to meet me halfway, to rebuild with me, not against me." Jordan met her gaze, his eyes flickering with something, perhaps regret, perhaps hope. He nodded, slowly at first, and then with more certainty. "We'll rebuild. Together. But it's going to take time, and it won't be easy." Lena nodded in return, the first spark of peace flaring in her chest. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. A few days later, Lena stood in the hospital wing she had once bought with such pride, the place that had symbolized her power and her need for control. It had been returned, as promised, and the space now felt different. The sterile white walls that had once felt so cold, so impersonal, now seemed warmer, more human. Lena stood in front of a group of hospital executives and staff. The room filled with energy, but this time, it was not about her empire. It was about the community, the people who would benefit from this space being used for something greater than just her power play. "We're donating this wing to the community," Lena said, her voice calm and steady, but filled with purpose. "This is no longer a symbol of my control. It's a symbol of what we can do when we work together. For the people, for the future." The executives exchanged glances, but they nodded in agreement. Lena knew this would be a long road, but this was the right step. Her legacy, once built on control, was now being rebuilt on something more lasting: loyalty, respect, and understanding. Back in the penthouse, Lena sat alone once again. The weight of the world had not completely lifted, but it was manageable now. She had made sacrifices, some too great to ever fully recover from, but there was one thing she had reclaimed: peace. The battle with her family was over, but the rebuilding had only just begun. Her phone buzzed once again, and she saw Elijah's name on the screen. She smiled softly as she read his message. "We're making it work, Mom. We've come a long way. I'm proud of us." Lena set the phone down, a deep breath escaping her as she stared out at the city, her heart light for the first time in years. The war within her was finally over. And for the first time in her life, she knew she was winning the battle that truly mattered, the one for herself.